Right now, across southwestern France and central Spain, thousands more people are being told to leave their homes, even as fire crews report their first real progress in nearly a week of nonstop fighting. On Tuesday, July 28, 2026, French authorities ordered nearly 4,000 more people evacuated from campsites, holiday villages, and tourist sites along the Atlantic coast near Lacanau, as a new wave of returning heat threatened to undo days of hard-fought progress against the massive wildfire burning west of Bordeaux. That fresh evacuation order pushed the combined total displaced across France and Spain to roughly 330,000 people, a number large enough that French officials themselves have described this as the country's biggest peacetime evacuation since the Second World War. And here is the detail that makes this moment so difficult to summarize in a single headline. In the exact same 24-hour period that those 4,000 new evacuations were ordered near Bordeaux, Spanish authorities lifted evacuation orders for 13 separate municipalities, and French crews reported a second, smaller wildfire in the neighboring Landes region had been fully contained, allowing thousands of evacuees there to finally go home. This is not a story with a single clean direction. It is two countries fighting the same underlying disaster on multiple fronts at once, winning ground in some places while losing it in others, all while a fourth heat wave of the summer bears down on Spain and a fresh heat spike threatens to reignite France's most stubborn fire line. Today, we are going to break down exactly what has changed, what is genuinely improving, what is genuinely getting worse, and why the overall evacuation total keeps climbing, even as officials describe some fire lines as stable. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the current facts, the data, and the real stakes as this story continues. Drop a comment below. Have you been following this story, and do you know anyone affected by these fires? Tell me where you are and what you have heard. If you want to know the moment this situation changes again, subscribe to Stellar Zone right now. It is completely free. A thumbs up also helps enormously. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one so the algorithm actually shows it to the people who need to see it. Thank you. Now, let us get into it. Let us start with the fire that has dominated headlines for the past week, the blaze burning through France's Gironde region, just west of Bordeaux. As of Tuesday morning, that fire had burned 420 square kilometers, an area roughly 4 times the size of the city of Paris, since it first ignited near Samos on July 22nd. Local authorities described the fire as having remained broadly stable overnight into Tuesday, following what officials called a calm, quiet night, with flare-ups near the coastal dunes brought back under control by firefighting crews. That stability, however, is exactly why Tuesday's new evacuation order matters so much. Authorities were not reacting to the fire suddenly growing overnight. They were reacting preemptively to a forecast heat wave, moving nearly 4,000 people out of tourist sites and holiday villages along the coast near Lacanau, specifically because rising temperatures threatened to reignite a fire line that firefighters had only just barely managed to hold in check. This is the defining pattern of this entire event. Containment in a wildfire this size is not a permanent state. It is closer to a fragile truce that has to be renewed and defended every single time weather conditions shift. And every time that truce looks at risk of breaking, officials would rather move thousands of people out of harm's way in advance than wait and react afterward. Now let us talk about where things are genuinely improving, because it would be dishonest to only tell the worsening half of this story. In the Landes region, immediately south of Gironde, a separate wildfire that had displaced more than 30,000 residents and vacationers has now been fully contained, according to French authorities, and evacuees from that specific fire have been allowed to return home. In Spain, the Interior Ministry announced that evacuation orders were lifted for 13 municipalities across 2 of the regions hit hardest by wildfires, effective Tuesday at 5 p.m. local time, though officials did not immediately specify how many residents that covered or whether all of them would return home right away. These are not small symbolic updates. A fully contained fire and a formally lifted evacuation order represent real, measurable progress, made by thousands of firefighters working around the clock, often in genuinely dangerous conditions. According to the latest French Prefecture Situation Report, 93 firefighters have been injured battling the Gironde blaze alone, with 10 requiring evacuation from the fire zone themselves. Progress in a disaster this size is never won without real cost to the people fighting it, and it is worth pausing on that fact rather than letting the raw evacuation numbers become the only part of this story people remember. At the same time, Spain's overall situation remains, by its own officials' description, genuinely severe. Spain has now entered its 4th heat wave of the summer, and several of its wildfires remain, in the words of officials, out of control, including what has already been confirmed as the country's largest wildfire on record, burning through Avila province northwest of Madrid. That is not a comparison to a bad fire season in recent memory. That is a confirmed, official superlative, the single largest wildfire Spain has ever recorded burning at the same time French crews are trying to hold their own fragile containment lines just across the border. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez personally visited the fire-hit region in Avila earlier in the crisis, alongside Madrid and Toledo provinces, both also affected by major blazes. Spain's Interior Minister formally declared a national state of emergency over the fires, a designation that unlocks coordinated national resources, including the involvement of Spain's Military Emergency Unit, which has been directing efforts on some of the country's largest and most dangerous fire fronts, alongside civilian firefighting crews. This crisis has also become a genuinely international firefighting effort, and that detail matters because it shows how a wildfire disaster of this scale stops being a single country's problem to solve alone. France formally requested activation of the European Union's Civil Protection Mechanism, and in response, Croatia sent Canadair water-bombing aircraft, Portugal sent air tractor firefighting planes, and additional international crews and equipment have continued arriving throughout the crisis. Separately, Greece deployed its own Canadair CL-415 water bombers directly to Spain under that same EU mechanism, joining operations specifically in the Burgo-Hondo area west of Madrid, one of the hardest-hit zones in the Avila fire complex. This is precisely what the European Union's civil protection system was built for, a shared pool of firefighting aircraft, equipment, and personnel that member states can call on when a disaster inside their own borders outpaces what their national resources alone can handle, and right now, multiple countries are actively drawing on that shared pool at the same time. It is worth pausing on that World War II comparison for a moment, because it is not a throwaway phrase. French officials are using it deliberately to convey scale to a domestic audience for whom that historical reference carries real weight. The last time France moved this many civilians out of a single region under emergency conditions was during the mass civilian evacuations tied to the German invasion and subsequent Allied liberation campaigns of the 1940s, moments etched into French national memory as among the most disruptive civilian displacements the country has ever experienced outside of wartime itself. Invoking that comparison is not dramatic flourish for its own sake, it is officials trying to communicate, in terms an entire country will immediately understand, that the sheer number of people currently displaced by this wildfire complex has no peacetime precedent in modern French history. That framing also helps explain why French authorities are treating even a seemingly small addition of 4,000 new evacuees with the same operational seriousness as the initial mass evacuations a week earlier, because the cumulative total climbing past 330,000 people is not simply a bigger number, it is a genuinely unprecedented civil emergency by the country's own historical standard. Spain's parallel crisis is unfolding against its own compounding backdrop. Entering a fourth heatwave in a single summer is itself an unusual burden for any country's firefighting resources and emergency services to absorb, since each successive heatwave arrives on top of vegetation that has had progressively less time to recover moisture between events, and on top of firefighting crews who have had progressively less time to rest between deployments. Spain's National Meteorological Agency has documented a broader pattern of increasingly frequent and intense summer heatwaves across the country over recent decades, a trend that directly compounds wildfire risk by drying out vegetation earlier in the season and keeping it critically dry for longer stretches at a time. A single severe heatwave produces one dangerous window of fire risk. 4 separate heatwaves within a single summer means Spain's firefighting services have had to mobilize, stand down, and remobilize repeatedly across just a few months, a considerably more exhausting and resource-intensive pattern than a single, however severe, isolated event. Let us talk about the economic toll, because the human displacement numbers, as staggering as they are, only capture part of what this disaster has actually cost. According to the local Chamber of Commerce and Industry, approximately 14,500 businesses across the Gironde region have been brought to a complete standstill, out of roughly 178,000 businesses operating in the wider region, and France's Ministry of Finance estimates that approximately 130,000 employees are currently unable to work as a direct result of the fires. That is a genuinely significant regional economic disruption layered directly on top of the immediate physical destruction and human displacement. The kind of impact that continues costing the region money and livelihoods well after the flames themselves are eventually extinguished. There is one specific economic angle to this story that deserves its own explanation, because it has generated real concern well beyond France's borders: the fate of this year's Bordeaux wine harvest. Bordeaux sits at the heart of one of the world's most famous wine-producing regions, and international wine enthusiasts have been reaching out directly to local experts, asking whether this year's vintage is already ruined. The reassuring answer, according to wine professionals working in the region, is that the vineyards themselves have not been directly impacted by the flames so far, and more importantly, the grapes currently on the vine are not yet large enough to be seriously vulnerable to what winemakers call smoke taint, a phenomenon where grapes absorb smoke compounds that can affect the eventual flavor of the wine. According to experts, including a winemaker and chemist at the University of California, Santa Cruz who studies this exact phenomenon, unripe grapes are considerably less vulnerable to smoke taint than fully ripened fruit closer to harvest, and Bordeaux's harvest is not expected to begin until early September, meaning there is still meaningful time for smoke conditions to clear before the grapes reach their most vulnerable stage. In the prestigious Margaux appellation specifically, vineyards have reportedly remained physically intact, with wine quality not currently expected to be affected. It is a small, specific detail inside an enormous disaster, but it captures something important about how differently various parts of a regional economy experience the same crisis: homes and forests destroyed within days, while a delicate agricultural product several weeks from harvest may yet escape largely unscathed. Now let us address the human cost directly, because behind every evacuation number is a family, and this crisis has not been without loss of life. At least one person has died in Spain's wildfires, with reporting confirming a death in Manises, a suburb of Valencia, marking one of the fire's earliest confirmed fatalities. For many residents now living through their second or third evacuation of this same summer, or in some cases their second major wildfire crisis within just a few years, the emotional toll compounds in a way that raw statistics cannot capture. One evacuee sheltering at a sports center converted into temporary housing in Moncofa, in Spain's Castellón region, told reporters that this was not the first time his community had faced this exact threat, describing a patch of dry grass and abandoned land behind his own house that had already caught fire once before in recent years, forcing an evacuation then as well. That sense of repetition, of the same specific piece of land catching fire more than once within a relatively short span of years, is showing up again and again across this crisis, echoing exactly the pattern we highlighted with the Gironde region's own history, struck by a catastrophic wildfire in 2022, and now struck again, considerably harder, just 4 years later. So what does the actual path forward look like from here? Infrastructure disruption remains significant and ongoing. The A63 highway near Bordeaux remains partially closed. Rail traffic south of Bordeaux has been suspended, with only the route toward Toulouse still operating. Officials in both countries have been careful to frame the coming days honestly rather than optimistically, describing the situation as improving in some specific locations, while explicitly warning that forecast heat could reignite exactly the kind of flare-ups that led to Tuesday's new evacuation order near Lacanau. That is the central, difficult truth of fighting a fire complex this large. Progress in one sector does not guarantee stability in another, and a single hot, dry, windy day can undo what took a full week of round-the-clock firefighting to achieve. So what does this actually mean for you, whether you are near the affected region or simply following this story from somewhere else? If you are anywhere in southwestern France or central Spain, particularly near any of the areas still under active evacuation orders or precautionary alerts, continue following official guidance exactly as issued, since the pattern this crisis has shown clearly is that conditions can shift within a single day once heat returns to an area authorities had previously described as stable. If you have travel plans to the Bordeaux region specifically, air quality within the city itself remains extremely poor due to persistent smoke, even though the city itself has not been evacuated, and both French tourism authorities and health officials have advised postponing non-essential travel to the area for now. And if you simply want to track how this specific crisis resolves, France's Civil Security Agency and Spain's Interior Ministry are both publishing real-time updates on evacuation orders, containment progress, and the specific municipalities affected as this situation continues to develop day by day. What is happening across France and Spain right now cannot be summarized as either purely getting better or purely getting worse, and any honest account of this crisis has to hold both of those truths at once. Thousands of people are finally going home in the Landes region and across 13 Spanish municipalities. Thousands more, just a few hours away, are being told to leave their homes for the very first time this week, specifically because the heat that started this entire crisis is returning to test containment lines that firefighters have only just barely managed to hold. 93 firefighters have been injured defending a single fire line west of Bordeaux. Spain is now battling the largest wildfire in its recorded history while entering its fourth heatwave of the summer. And an international coalition of firefighting aircraft and crews from Croatia, Portugal, and Greece are now working alongside French and Spanish forces specifically because this disaster has grown large enough that no single country's resources were judged sufficient to fight it alone. Recovery, whenever it finally begins in earnest, will not follow a single timeline either. Some evacuees are already back in their homes this week. Others, particularly in the hardest-hit parts of Gironde and Avila, will be looking at months of rebuilding, insurance claims, and in the case of entire pine forests reduced to ash, a recovery measured in years rather than weeks, since a forest planted today will not reach anything resembling its previous maturity within the lifetime of most people currently living through this crisis. We will keep tracking this as it develops, every new evacuation order, every contained fire line, and whatever the coming heatwave does to a crisis that is very much still active. Subscribe to Stellar Zone so you do not miss it, and leave that comment below. Have you been following this story, and do you know anyone affected by these fires? Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. See you in the next one.